My name is Rodney Hayes Duncan. I have written a series of stories which I'm going to start off with one called War and the End of War. If you care to watch it, I think it will enlighten you about some aspects of our society that we must learn to deal with. I was born on March 11th, 1944 in San Diego, California. This was only 17 months before the end of World War II. At the time, however, no one knew the war was going to end that quickly. I was blessed with a phenomenal memory, and I remember things from my childhood starting when I was only months old, perhaps even weeks old. I remember getting baths in a bassinet, lying in a crib and arching my back so that my paternal grandfather could pick me up and carry me around. I remember my mother and my father carrying me as a baby. I remember lying in my baby bed in my mother's bedroom when my paternal grandmother, Ella Mae Duncan, came to visit us from Texas. I was only 5 months old at the time. At that time, when people came to visit, even though we only had 2 bedrooms, we shared our homes and our beds. Mama Dunk started to get in bed with my mother. Even though we only had the 2 beds, I knew that this strange person was in our house and was not supposed to be getting into my mother's bed. Even at the tender age of 5 months, I knew that this was not right. There were not supposed to be strange people in my bedroom. So I kicked up quite a fuss, so much so that they had to wait until I went to sleep before, with the lights turned out, they could finally go to bed. I mention these happenings to establish the timeline of my memory because conventional thinking has it that children can't remember anything that happens when they are very young. I know this is not true. I think children remember everything. I think children remember being in the womb. However, as I said in the introduction, this is my interpretation of what I remember. The war permeated everything. It was the topic of everyone's conversation. I remember the war news on the radio. I remember the concern in my parents' and grandparents' voices as they talked about the war. I remember at a very young age hearing loud howling noises coming from the bay as the hospital ships came in and unloaded the wounded for ambulance transport to the area hospitals. The sound would go on day and night until suddenly it stopped, and that hospital ship, under the cover of night, would disappear back into the Pacific for another load. I remember the sadness when members of our family and our friends were found to be forever gone. I remember the fear and the palatable anxiety that permeated every aspect of our lives during the first 17 months of my life. Never forget that freedom's price is high. It has been paid many times in our history. We live in a blackout area. This meant no street lights, no front porch lights, no lights that could be seen from outside the houses at night. What cars there were on the streets had tiny slits in the covers that fitted over the headlights and taillights, lowering their output to almost nothing. I remember the blackout curtains hanging on the windows. I was told that if I touched them, I and everyone in the house could be shot. This was told to me in such seriousness that I was afraid to come near the windows at night in that small 2-story house in the 2100 block of B Street we lived in until the war was over. On that wonderful day in August 1945, when we heard that the war was over, my mother and grandmother did something that startled me. They tore down the blackout curtains. I was terrified and started crying. My mother reassured me, picked me up, and took me out on the street. There, with everyone else in our neighborhood, we all danced and laughed and shrieked and cried and got down on our knees and thanked God. When I finally got the fact that this horrible thing called war was over, I did not truly understand. What I did understand was that the all-pervasive feeling of fear was gone. Even small children can feel the weight of fear. Even small children can feel the wonder of relief. That night my mother took me on the side of a hill overlooking the city, and there were so many lights and searchlights and ship lights and every kind of light imaginable that San Diego seemed to be on fire. Sailors and soldiers and Marines were walking the streets, grabbing, swinging around, and dancing with anyone they saw. I have never seen so many happy people. It is good to remember the negative aspects of war and the positive aspects of the end of war. Even with our current war in Iraq, except for those actively engaged in it with their families and their friends, we have forgotten what it means to be at war. I hate to say it, but the only way that many people of the United States will ever truly understand what it means to be at war is if we have to fight on our own soil. That day may be far closer than we think. All we have to do to hasten that day is to continue to allow our enemies to think that we're weak and uncommitted as our nation to our faith and our self-protection. May God continue to bless us. May He not feel it necessary to chastise us. As I approach the end of my life's journey, I am secure in my faith and the love of God and His grace and forgiveness. But once again, I see fear permeating the society of the United States. Citizens are afraid to speak up against evil for fear of being chastised or thought politically incorrect. I see people turning to crutch after crutch for the relief of this fear. People by the millions are turning to artificial chemicals for the relief of fear and anxiety. A dear friend of mine told me he was using meth because it made him feel better. My next question to him, "What about your faith?" was answered predictably. It is not as strong as it needs to be. And that short interchange of phrases is the answer for society. As a nation, but especially as individuals, our faith needs to be strengthened. People need no longer to be afraid to stand for the right for fear that they themselves will land in jail. They rely on police officers for protection. But I know from personal experience of having been a police officer in Oakland, California for over 5 years, police officers, unless they happen on a crime in progress, are unable to protect almost anyone. Their primary function in today's society is as a glorified legal recording secretary. It has gotten to the point that these wonderful men and women who feel in their souls the necessity of and possess the ability to stand between the good and evil in our society are more and more the targets of the negative aspects of the media and the paid propaganda artists that seek to undermine our basic foundations. We must not remain the huddled masses. We must determine to stand up for the right, and it must start with each and every one of us. We have no more time. God bless America.